Welcome to our 7th class on Jesus and his parables. Today we will look at the parable of the prodigal son, also called the parable of the 2 lost sons. One son is lost at a distance while the second son is lost even though he stayed home. This is the third of the trio in the parables of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and now the lost sons. Let's remember how Jesus set the stage for these 3 parables at the beginning of Luke chapter 15. Here we see the grace of the gospel. Ordinary people are coming to listen to Jesus, even though the religious leaders act like sinners don't belong and shouldn't be there. The religious leaders are mumbling and grumbling about this grace. The word Luke uses for grumbling is the same word that is used when the Israelites are complaining in the wilderness, when Moses is leading them to the promised land. The Pharisees were terribly offended that Jesus was teaching about God's grace and then acting on it by accepting sinners just as they were. This third parable of the lost is directed at the Pharisees. Now, let's turn to the parable. I'd encourage you to download the handout of the text found on the class website and follow along. Oftentimes, people see this parable as having 2 stories within the parable, but notice how Jesus begins the parable. There are 3 characters in the story, a man and his 2 sons. In some ways, the older son is the key figure, even though we tend to focus on the actions of the younger son. The younger son speaks first, asking for his share of the property. Now, don't miss what he's saying. When does a child gain their family's wealth? Before or after their parent dies? In the vast majority of times, it's after. In rare instances, a father could divide his property while he was still living, but he would retain control over it. The son would possess the land, but he couldn't sell it. This is similar to what many farm families do when they establish a life estate, where land is willed to a child when one parent dies, but the surviving parent continues to receive the profit from the land while they are alive. So, when the younger son asks for his share of the property, he doesn't want to just possess the land, but he wants the right to sell it for cold, hard cash. In other words, he wishes his father would hurry up and die. When people in the Middle East hear this parable today, their response is immediate. Impossible. The father should beat his son for wanting him dead. Despite the terrible disrespect, the father does divide the property. According to Jewish law, the estate would be divided 2/3 to the older son and 1/3 to the younger. The oldest child always got an extra portion of the inheritance. Now, the son didn't break any laws when he requested his property, but he certainly broke his father's heart and gives us a glimpse into the character of the son and the relationship he has with his father. Not only does this request hurt his father, but it also affects the entire family and clan. Remember, there are no bank accounts or 401ks to raid in order to satisfy the request for money. A family's wealth was tied up in the house, land, and animals they owned. If you had to sell quickly, you would end up selling at a very low price. In the Middle East, with its tradition of haggling for days over even the smallest transaction, selling in a hurry means selling at a loss. For a family to sell 1/3 of its assets at a low price would mean a huge loss. Now read the text closely. Notice the son doesn't ask for his inheritance, but for his property. He avoids using the word inheritance because that means he would also have to accept responsibility for the family and clan. This responsibility meant he was obligated to care for the property on behalf of the family, to settle quarrels that might arise, to defend the honor of the family, to increase the family's wealth, and to represent the family honorably at village functions like weddings, feasts, and funerals. The younger son doesn't want responsibility. He wants privilege. He wants money. What the younger son is actually doing is cutting himself off from his family, which is his real inheritance. The son's family is the source of his physical and emotional well-being, the support he needs as he ages, the relationships that will open doors for him if he needs work or a network of friends. The younger son trades what is permanent for what is temporary. He chooses to sever his relationship with his family, breaking his father's heart. Now, the older son is well aware of what's going on, whether he happened to overhear the conversation or not. In fact, everyone in the village will know very soon what the younger son and his father talked about. In a dispute between his father and his younger brother, the older son was expected to be the mediator, working to reconcile father and son. For the sake of the father, the older son should begin immediately to smooth relationships between his father and his little brother. And he should do this even if he detested his little brother. The fact the older son doesn't assume this responsibility is evidence that the relationship between him, his father, and his little brother is really bad. There is quite enough dysfunction to go around in this family. Note, the father doesn't disown his son, as would be expected in the biblical culture. Had the father disowned his son, there would have been no chance for reconciliation in the future. The break in the relationship would have been permanent. Instead, the father gives his younger son permission to take his inheritance and leave. In the days prior to his departure, the younger son would have spent time converting his property into coins he could take with him. And since the village knew what was happening, the son had to deal with the scorn of the entire village. The son lost the relationship he had with his father, his brother, and now with the members of the village. He chooses to sever all of his ties. Now, we're not told the name of the country where the younger son travels, nor how he loses money. Later in the parable, the older son accuses his brother of losing his money on immoral living, but the Greek word that is translated as wild in the NIV and NLT translations would better be translated as extravagant living, without the insinuation of sexual misdeeds his older brother will throw at him later on. Remember, the younger son cut himself off from the community and would need a new circle of friends. It's quite possible he spent his money foolishly, trying to gain friends by spending on lavish parties and buying expensive gifts. When he has money, he has friends. When the money runs out, so do the friends. Now, he's in real trouble. He has no support, he's in a foreign land, and then a famine hits. At first, the son tries to find a job. In the Greek, Jesus says the son literally glued himself to a local citizen, hoping he would get a job. A citizen would be a man of standing in the community and likely knew the son was a Jew who at one time had money. The man probably hopes that if he offers the son a job feeding pigs, who are not kosher for Jews, the son would walk away from the job offer and just leave him alone. One cultural nuance to note. During biblical times, pigs weren't kept in pens, but wandered along the roads, functioning as garbage disposals. So the son would be on public display and his humiliation made complete. But the son is desperate. So even though taking this job will make him an outcast in Jewish eyes, he accepts it. Note, the son would have tried to eat what the pigs were eating, but the food was not fit for human consumption. And since no one gave him anything, we can assume he tried begging passerbys without success. He's fallen as far as he could go. His survival was at stake. It was when he was desperate that the son came to his senses. He had to head back home before he was so weak he couldn't walk. But he needed a plan. He hoped that since his father didn't disown him, he would not be rejected if he returned home. The son also had to figure out what to do about his older brother. If his father allowed him to return, he would be financially supported by his brother. And if his older brother treated him badly before, it would only get worse. Plus, he had to worry about how the villagers would react. He couldn't just walk through the village to his father's house, but would have to stand at the outskirts of the village and send a message, waiting for hours or even days before he found out if his father would agree to meet with him. And all that time, he'd be subject to the villagers' ridicule and scorn. The son devises a plan. He'll tell his father that he sinned against him and God and can no longer be considered his son. Instead, he will ask his father to treat him like an apprentice so he could learn a trade and support himself. Maybe he even hoped he could work hard enough to pay back some of the money he squandered and regain a little dignity. If he could support himself, he wouldn't have to live at home and run into his brother all the time. Now, with this strategy in mind, he heads home. Notice, he hasn't repented, but is concerned simply with his physical survival. In the meantime, back at home, the father hasn't forgotten his son. We can certainly imagine he is worried and anxious, enduring the sideways glances of his neighbors, the murmuring of his older son. He probably can't stop himself from looking down the road in hopes of catching a glimpse of his wayward son. One day, while glancing down the road, the father notices a man who he soon realizes is his younger son. His heart is filled with compassion, and he runs to meet his son. Now, here's a cultural distinction we can't miss. Running in the Middle East is done by little boys or teenagers. Old men never run. They walk with great dignity. Yet the father runs. Why? Remember, when the son asked for his inheritance, he didn't sin only against his father and family, but against the whole village. And the village isn't likely to be as forgiving as his father, and instead may perform what is called a ketsetzah ceremony. This is an Aramaic term meaning cutting off, and describes how a community would shun a person who sold land to a Gentile. The villagers would fill a large jar with burned corn and break it in front of the son while shouting, "He is cut off from his community." The village knew the son sold the land and then spent the money in Gentile country, the equivalent to selling land to a Gentile. The only way the son could be reinstated after this ceremony would be to buy back the land. But he's penniless. The father needs to reach his son first because the village will follow his example. If the father welcomes his son, so will the village. But if the father rejects his son, the village will reject him as well. So the father runs to his son, demeaning himself further. The father would have to hold up his robe so he wouldn't trip, possibly exposing his legs and maybe even his undergarments. Quite taboo in this culture. The father cast aside all dignity to reach his rebellious son. The two meet in the road. An obedient son has the right to kiss his father's hands in greeting, but a disobedient son only has the right to fall to the ground and kiss his father's feet. Notice the text. The father won't let his son fall to the ground, instead embracing and kissing him. The father accepts his son back into the family. In fact, the son only gets out a few words of his prepared speech before his father takes over and does all the talking. What a reversal. The father doesn't just welcome his son, but restores him to the family. The best robe is likely from the father's own wardrobe. The ring is a symbol of authority in the household, and shoes are reserved for sons, not servants. The son who hoped he'd be a servant or an apprentice in his father's house has been fully reinstated in the family as a beloved son. The father's actions decree how the son is to be treated from now on. Then everyone is invited to a feast to celebrate. The fatted calf, which is expensive and a part of the older son's inheritance, is to be slaughtered to feed the village. The focus shifts from the son to the father. The father is the honored host who is overflowing with joy. He will receive the guests and set the tone for the entire village. Because the father's actions will guide the behavior of the villagers, he is the banquet's VIP, not the younger son. Now, the older son also has an important role to play in the celebration. He should be there to help his father welcome the guests and be the picture of hospitality. Now, the son isn't home when the party begins. He's out in the field supervising the hired hands, making sure the workers are paid at the end of the day. When the older son does return home, he asks one of the boys who are hanging around, "What's going on?" When the older son discovers the celebration is because his little brother is back home, he's furious. The entire atmosphere of the house changes. The older son will not go in. He makes his anger known publicly. This is extremely insulting. You do not air your family's dirty laundry in public. Everyone turns to the father to see how he will handle the situation. Because he's the patriarch, he should not go outside, leaving his place of honor and his guest. To do so would humiliate the father yet again. He should completely ignore his older son and refuse to go outside. Yet that's exactly what he does. The father is met with his older son's rage. "You've never done anything like this for me, even though I've stayed home and slaved for you." Notice, the son doesn't address his father with his title, a deliberate slight to his father. The older son also refers to his brother as his father's son rather than my brother, and insinuates his brother squandered his money on prostitutes without having any evidence. Let's imagine how the older son is thinking. He never left his father. He stayed home and fulfilled all his duties. So his father should be impressed with him, right? He's done so much for his father, but received so little in return. Apparently, the older son views his relationship with his father as transactional, rather than a relationship based on love and respect. The older son displays the attitude of a slave arguing about a labor disagreement, not the attitude of a son. The older son accuses his father of not allowing him one little celebration with his friends. Here's another cultural subtlety. The son's friends should include his brother, father, and the guests that are celebrating with them right now. But the older son's community is elsewhere. He has rejected his family. Even though the older son lived at home, he's hated his father and denies any relationship to his younger brother. He's felt like an outcast in his own home. He and his younger brother are alike in more ways than the older brother is willing to acknowledge. Despite this, the father responds to his angry son with kindness and compassion. He calls him a beloved son and reminds him that all the father has is his. The father does not withhold anything from his son and does not practice favoritism. Now, we're not told how the older son responds to his father. In this culture, the audience would not have been surprised if, in his rage, the older son tried to beat his father up. When the older son's anger finally cools, we can only hope he asks himself why his father acts this way toward him and his little brother. As the weeks go by and the younger son goes back to work, can you imagine how his attitude was different than it was before he left? His transformation didn't happen when he was in danger of starving in a distant land, but when he saw his father running towards him and experienced his welcome home. The father didn't impose rules and restrictions on his sons or force them to do things against their will. Instead, the father allowed his sons to do their worst to him so he could do his best for them. The father offers both his sons a relationship built on love and forgiveness. The only question is whether they choose to accept it. It is this same relationship of love and forgiveness through Jesus that God offers us today. I pray we all choose to accept that relationship. To summarize this parable, the parable is directed at the Pharisees and the religious leaders. The parable describes two sons who have a broken relationship with their father. Repentance can be of two types. One is repentance of a person who thinks they can save themselves, while the second is of a person who knows they can't. God's love seeks and suffers any cost in order to save. One son is restored from being a servant back to being a beloved son. One son insists on remaining a servant. Thanks for joining us. Next week, we will look at the parable of the dishonest steward. Please read Luke chapter 16, verses 1 to 8 to prepare. Until then, keep the faith.